and first of all, also again, many thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak in this exciting online lecture series, and also big thanks to all of you for attending. Yeah, well, since I do work on both Anglophone and Gaelic Scottish culture, and Gaelic studies is a little bit less common, especially in Germany, we thought that you would enjoy a topic that links both languages. So I decided to give a talk into a little research project that I'm currently doing, so nothing to do with the latest book, but just a small, very small kind of essay-shaped project. And this is concerned with the history of a popular song from the 18th century that is known by a variety of names, but which is today most commonly known under the title The Garb of Old Gaul. So garb as in garment, and I'll tell you about the Gaul bit. Why is it Gaulish a moment later. Now the song is reasonably well known and is associated with the Highland soldiers in the British Army, and this is why I've also got an image of an 18th century Highland soldier on my title slide. So the song is reasonably well known and seems quite simple on the surface, but I think that there is a lot more to the song than meets the eye. And my little project tries to do some editing of the different versions of the text and tries to tease out some of the complexities, the history of the different versions, who's had a hand in it and why and when and where. So yeah, and I think this, for a public lecture such as this one, I think it's also interesting because it is like a little microcosm that exemplifies many important trends in 18th century society and culture, all in a few stanzas. For example, it does tell us a lot about ethnic relations, social mobility, spatial mobility, different kinds of aesthetics that were competing at the time, and also about imperial ideology and historical change. So this is why I picked it for today. But before we get to the song itself, I would like to outline a few key background facts for those who are not overly familiar with 18th century Scottish history or with the time that went before that. And I know that you've got some regular attendees, but I was told there might also be some new faces. So for the novices to Scottish culture, I'll say a few words on some basic backgrounds. The experts will hopefully forgive me. I hope I won't bore you for too long with basics and get to the song soon. Okay, so concerning the basic backgrounds, what do we need to know? Well, first of all, it's important to remember that since the late Middle Ages, in fact, the differences between Highland Scotland and Lowland Scotland were perceived as becoming more pronounced and also more problematic. Gaelic had been very dominant in Scottish culture for some time in the Middle Ages. By the time of the late Middle Ages, it was receding, and it was pretty much receding to what we now know as the Highlands and Islands. There's some complications to that, but that's a simplified version. And Scots and English was on the rise. It had, kind of taken root in the lowlands in the southeast first, and then was spreading onwards. And of course, that's also where, for example, the court was in Edinburgh. The cities were mainly in the English-speaking parts and the Scots-speaking parts. So ever since the late Middle Ages, there was this idea that the modernity, the future of Scottish culture, lay with Scots and English. It lay in the lowlands, and the Highlands were a bit more backwards and traditional, a bit more unruly. They needed to be subdued and assimilated. That was the idea. So this idea has a very long history, and in kind of colonial discourse analysis, kind of post-colonial studies, we often call that kind of way of talking about supposedly primitive people, we call this ignoble savagery. So the non-noble savages, the savages that are worthy of being kind of despised, and the savages you look down on. Okay, so ignoble savagery. Now also let us remember that pre-1603, Scotland and England were fully separate states. Then there was the Union of the Crowns in 1603 when Scotland and England had a dynastic union, so same monarch but still separate states, separate parliaments. And later on then, 1707, we have the full union, so Scotland and England joining the parliaments, one pan-British state in the making. Now, in the meantime, we also have a revolution, and this is also important for some of the history of the song that I'll be telling you about. So in the 1680s, we have on the throne in London, King James VII of Scotland and King James II of England. He's a Catholic, and he's also tending towards absolutism. Parliament is not happy about that. The Protestant majority of the country is also not very happy about having a Catholic on the throne. So we have a revolution that deposes this king, and they're settling on some relations of his who are Protestants and also more inclined to pay more heed to Parliament. So this exiled monarch James goes into exile. He does, however, have some support for various reasons. People support him for different reasons, not just because they're Catholic. Some people are, have other reasons for supporting him, so I can't go into details there. But we have here the beginnings of the so-called Jacobite movement, because the Latin form of the name James is Jacobus, and this is why his followers are called the Jacobites. And this will haunt us till the mid-18th century, at least, these periodic outbursts of Jacobitism. And what's also important about the Jacobite movement is clearly, the throne has been given to somebody else. So the now Protestant dynasty, or the Protestant relations of King James, are controlling the British government army. Now, if you want a rebel force that is Jacobite, you need to find your soldiers elsewhere. And the Highland chieftains still retain something like private armies. So if as a Jacobite, if I can get the Highland chieftains on my side, I can use the private armies. So this is why the Highland soldiers play an important part in the different Jacobite uprisings and Jacobite rebellions and the Jacobite fighting back that we're getting. And of course, as somebody who's a centralist, who is, in favor of the new Protestant dynasty, in favor of this new state, then the Highlanders are even more suspect, because not only are they savages and ignoble, but now they're also sources of rebellion. They're the enemies of an orderly state and the enemies of government. So actually this idea of the Highlanders as ignoble savages gets further exacerbated, unless, of course, if you're a Jacobite yourself, and then you might, have a more positive image of Highland soldiers. Okay. Now, the unions with England intensify the drive to Anglicize Scotland and also assimilate the Highlands. As we see, this happened even during Scottish independence. But after the unions with England, clearly England doesn't have a Gaelic-speaking population segment. So to make Scotland more like England, again, there's even more pressure to assimilate the Gaels. Then the major Jacobite uprisings, other than the ones during the revolution itself, when the revolution took some time to be successful, the next major uprisings are 1715 and then 45-46. Again, relying heavily on Highland armies, the uprisings are unsuccessful, and Jacobites are finally at the Battle of Culloden in April 1746. After Culloden, they have another intensification of these attempts to subdue and assimilate the Highlands. The idea was, never again should this be a source of rebellion. So the chiefs lose their private armies, and then they also use some legal powers they had in terms of regional autonomy in the Highlands. There's also further cultural assimilation policies. The Highland dress is banned for most occasions, except for costume parties and the British Army, but otherwise you can't just walk along the street in the Highlands in your traditional peasant garb. You have to wear trousers now. So various ideas of break the back of this rebellious and ignobly savage Highland culture. Now these assimilation attempts and these attempts at subduing them have some success, and the more success that these policies have, the more it becomes safe to release the pressure on Highland culture and rehabilitate them and say, right, okay, they're showing themselves to be relatively peaceable subjects. They are learning more English. So they're contributing to the new state. They're being reconciled to the new status quo. So as we recognize that, we can see, right, maybe they have the potential of being good subjects after all. From the 1750s onwards, we also seen increasing recruitment of Highland soldiers into the British government army, and they are sorely needing soldiers because we've got various important wars on. First of all, we've got the 7 Years' War that lasts from the 1750s to the 60s. It's got various causes. I'm not going into detail, but one of the key factors of this is there's a colonial rivalry between Britain and France in North America. So they're fighting for supremacy. In the end, for example, Britain will also win some territory from the French in what is today Canada and so forth. So these are will be some of the outcomes. But for the 7 Years' War, the British Army needs many more soldiers, and the Highlands have a military tradition, and the military tradition is no longer being used for private armies of chieftains, but this idea of this military potential could be harnessed for the British government army takes off in the 1750s, and later we've got more recruitment also in the American War of Independence in the 70s and 80s. Again, the British Army needs soldiers for this war in North America, again comes to the Highlands. We've got further recruitment during the Napoleonic Wars, later in the century, in the early 19th century, and so forth. And as the Highlanders are, helping the British Army to have all these big overseas successes, they're getting increasingly, also this contributes to their respectability, and they're not just becoming respectable, but they're also getting increasingly romanticized. So they might still be seen as savage, somewhat primitive, somewhat backwards, but maybe it's a noble kind of savagery rather than an ignoble savagery. For example, the wildness of a savage could threaten a state, as it did before, but it can also, if you harness it for the state in the British government army, the wildness can frighten your enemies, such as the French. So maybe that's good. Or maybe so-called savages are not good at rationality and science. They're a bit emotional and passionate. But well, that also means maybe that they're very good at romantic poetry and things like that. So maybe I could then celebrate their artistic genius and their creativity. And this is also something that is happening in the late 18th century. So this idea of Highlanders as noble savages. And we also have competing aesthetic trends here. In the 18th to the early 19th century, we have a strong classicist streak. Also think of the Enlightenment in philosophy, but actually also there's also somewhat classicist, rationalistic in orientation. Order is important both in classicist art and also in enlightened rationality, enlightened philosophy, and so forth. There's classicist poetry about all of that in English and in other European languages. And then, I'm sure lots of you will know that Romanticism arises as a counter movement or a complementary movement to this in Scotland quite early, from about 1760 onwards, and this lasts into the 19th century. So again, we've got things that were previously bedeviled as primitive, emotional, too spontaneous, too irrational, and suddenly this becomes romanticizable, positive. So a bit more British, less classicist, more homegrown. Medievalism, again, these are maybe more British traditions. Maybe folklore becomes fashionable, emotions become fashionable, genius, and so forth. And all of this is revaluation of the primitive, of the non-rational, also impacts on the perception of the Highlands and also of Scottish traditions in Britain in general. So much for the backgrounds. Somebody made a noise. I don't know. Does somebody have a question maybe already? No? Okay. Right. In that case, we can get to the song. So we need some of this background to see where the song actually comes from. So the song is known, as I said, mainly now as the Garb of Old Gaul, but it's also known under variant titles such as the Highland March or the Highland Character earlier on. And it is commonly dated to the 7 Years' War, so the 50s to the 60s. This war that I just mentioned, where the British Army starts recruiting Highland soldiers big time. And indeed, the song does praise Highland soldiers. So, it seems quite plausible on the surface that this song then comes from the 7 Years' War. But, well, this is what is said commonly, and I think actually this might need revising. I've got different ideas about dating. So that's also part of my project, actually, trying to figure out the dates. And as I said, when was it changed and for what reason? which version was done by whom, and how does it also reflect changing circumstances and ideologies. I must also add a disclaimer that my work on the song is still very much a work in progress. So I still got various open questions as well. I'll also be very happy for your input. Maybe you'll throw up further questions I'll need to answer at some point. But yeah, I hope it gives an insight into what I'm currently doing, but also actually it's a slice of, I think, a general trend of research in Gaelic studies at the present moment and in recent years, because a lot of Gaelic scholars are currently paying more attention to what are the Gaels doing in the empire. What are they doing in the Imperial Army? What are they doing once they get to North America? How does their identity change? How do they contribute to a British imperial identity? Also then transculturalism is an issue. So the American experience will transform people. But even in Britain, the transcultural experience, this Anglicization, the assimilation policies will transform people and their identities and their self-perceptions, even those who don't even make it to North America. Their identities will change, just by staying at home and witnessing all these changes in Scotland at the time, and having to tackle these assimilation policies and these also different ways of being seen as a Gael. The Anglophone mainstream treats you in a certain way, sees you as primitive. Is it an ignoble primitive? Is it a noble primitive? You have to negotiate that as a Gael, as you're talking to non-Gaels, to English speakers. How do you present yourself? So this is generally, quite a large area of research in Gaelic studies, and I'm kind of part of this trend in a sense, and trying to contribute a few pieces to this general jigsaw. So what do we know about our song? It was composed by a man called John Reid, who was an army officer from central Scotland, from Perthshire, and his career included a long period in a regiment called the Black Watch from 1751 to 1770. So the Black Watch is actually the earliest Highland regiment in the British Army, and also still one of the most famous. So he was in that regiment, and the tune that Reid wrote for this song was first published in 1761 in a book called A Collection of Airs and Marches, edited by Robert Bremner. And the earliest book which publishes the lyrics to this song is actually a bit later, and that's an anthology called The Lark from 1765. And a second version of these lyrics appears again anonymously in another anthology that was edited by David Hurd, and this anthology is called Ancient and Modern Scots Songs, Heroic Ballads, etc. So that's 1769. And here it has the title The Highland March, for example. Now, from the second edition of Hurd's anthology onwards, we also suddenly get a name associated with these lyrics. So it's now said in this 1776 edition, the second edition, that the lyrics for the song are ascribed to a man called Sir Harry Erskine. And this is unanimously taken to refer to Sir Harry Erskine of Alva and Cambus Kenneth, and who hailed also from central Scotland, like Reid, but not from Perthshire, but neighbouring Stirlingshire. And Erskine was also an officer in the army. He was in several regiments, not in Reid's Black Watch, but in other ones. And this ascription to Reid is often repeated, even though it is not undisputed. But I've decided to accept Sir Harry Erskine as a possible composer of these lyrics for the moment. Now, despite some textual variations and one additional stanza, Hurd's version is still very close to the lyrics from 1765, and most discussions of the song are based on one of these two versions, the 65 version and the 69 one. Before I go into the lesser known versions, I would like to briefly review the one from 1765. Some of you might already know it, those who have done Scottish studies for some time. But for those who don't or need a refresher, I thought we'd play the music from a YouTube video that I found, and then I'll also, so Hannah will kindly play the YouTube because we had some technical issues before, and then I'll share the slides with the lyrics and you can read along while the song plays. So Hannah, could you start playing?
Yes, I will start playing the song.
Okay.
Can you hear the song?
Yeah. Now it's got silent. Good. I can't hear it now. I could hear it.
Okay,
before.
okay. I'll play again.
Thank you, Hannah, very much. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the kind of music that this is. So you can tell it's a military march, and it's actually still the Black Watches regimental march. So they've kind of adopted it as their signature tune, in fact. Okay, so just some details now about the text. Now, the last stanza of the 1765 text clearly references two key events from this 7 Years' War, namely the siege of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. We've got this reference, Quebec and Cape Breton, the pride of old France, in the last stanza, right? So Cape Breton, there was an important French fortress on Cape Breton Island off the east coast of Canada, and that was called Louisbourg. And there was a siege. The British troops besieged it in 1758, and they won it. And then later in 1759, we have another important fortress, which is Quebec City, and the French have an important fort there. And again, the Brits kind of, they come and they take that, they take Quebec from the French. They win the Battle of Quebec in 1759. So these references to these two key events from the 7 Years' War, from 1758 and 1759, are probably the main reason why most people assume that this song was composed during the 7 Years' War. And the time of the first publication, during or shortly after this conflict, so let's remind ourselves, it comes out in the early 60s, is probably another reason why people think, yeah, this must be a 7 Years' War text. 1761, the war is still ongoing. 65, the war's just recently ended. People are probably proud that they won the war. So it makes sense to assume that this is where that song is from. A third reason why people often assume, I think, that this song is from the 50s and 60s is that this war was a major factor of the popularization of the image of the Highlanders as noble savages that I talked about earlier. So I said, the increasing recruitment of Highlanders into the British government army and their contribution to British military success abroad was one of the reasons why the Highlanders could now be seen, okay, they're a bit savage, but they're actually noble savages. We need their valor. We can romanticize their bravery because we as a state, as a British state, are profiting from this. So if the 7 Years' War was a major reason for this recruitment, for this romanticization, then again, it makes sense that this rather idealizing song here is actually about the 7 Years' War. So let's just break this down a bit. In the Garb of Old Gaul and Fire of Old Rome, the Garb of Gaul refers back to, antiquity. And those who did Latin might remember Julius Caesar's text, De Bello Gallico, the Gaulish Wars, which is about the Roman conquest of, well, kind of parts of Switzerland, parts of Germany, parts of most of what today is France. So you know, the Gauls, think of Asterix. So the idea is that the modern Celts, such as the Gaels, were supposedly descended or kind of related, culturally related and potentially genetically related to the ancient Gauls. That was a popular idea. And the idea is the Gauls are, of course, also savages that used to be conquered by Rome. And so the Gaels are the modern savages that are, you know, are now being assimilated by the center of civilization of their own day, which is not Rome, but, you know, England and southern Scotland. So the idea is that we've got this juxtaposition between the civilized and the savage, the kind of Gaulish, Celtic, Gaelic. And the idea is also that the Highland dress, the kilts or the plaids, are allegedly similar to what the ancient Gauls wore, which is odd because I think historically they wore trousers. But the idea here is, you know, supposedly that the kilt is a very ancient dress from antiquity. And of course, as we saw from the title slide that I showed, the 18th century Highland soldiers, they actually wore Highland dress. And this is an iconic outfit that, you know, is part of the Highland regiments, and they're recognizable instantly by the kilt. So this garment is now, you know, previously it was banned, but now in the army it's legalized and it's getting romanticized here as a mark of a noble savage. Okay, and this idea that the Romans endeavored to gain their country, there's a reference in Tacitus's Agricola, where, you know, which is about the Roman army's conquest of Britain, and there's a famous battle somewhere in Scotland, Mons Graupius, where the Romans allegedly encountered the Caledonians, and I think both sides claim that they won it. But Scottish texts tend to claim that the Caledonians fought back and they put a stop to it. So the Romans never got all the way to the Orkneys. They only got, you know, to southern Scotland because the Caledonians allegedly fought back. So this idea of, okay, we're resistant to civilization, but there's also something heroic about it. And of course, this martial valor, this inherited martial valor of the ancient Celts is now being inherited by the modern Gaels. That's the idea. And you can see further on there's more noble savagery in this text, such as no effeminate customs or sinuous embrace. So we're not kind of womanly, but really tough men. We're hyper masculine. We don't, you know, we're not very greedy with our food. You know, we're satisfied with simple things. The bagpipes, signature Highland instrument, are also something martial. So again, our military tradition shows in the pipe music. A lot of noble savagery that seems to date this song quite clearly to this period when this kind of romanticization gets fashionable, and that is, you know, the 50s, 60s. So much for the standard narrative. However, well, basically, there's also other versions of this song. And I'd like to look at these for a moment, and then I'll tell you more about the dating issue. Here are some lesser known versions. One of them is in the manuscripts of an army chaplain, James McLagan. So he was one of the 18th century's most important collectors of Gaelic poetry. And he was a chaplain of the Black Watch Regiment from 1764, just after the war, to 1788. Many texts from his manuscript collection, including his two versions of our song, were reproduced with minor variations in an important early printed anthology of Gaelic poetry. And this is John Gillies' collection of ancient and modern Gaelic poems and songs from 1786. So this collection is pretty much an excerpt of McLagan's manuscripts, and McLagan probably had a good hand in editing these because the printer wasn't very competent in Gaelic. So he strongly relied on Mr. McLagan for this. So this is a very famous collection, the McLagan manuscripts, and he's got two versions of this song too. So McLagan and Gillies gave an English version of our song, which is also linked to Harry Erskine's name, like these earlier texts were. But they give this English version side by side with a Gaelic text that is identified as a translation by a man called Morrison, no first name given, who was, they say, an assistant sergeant in Fraser's regiment. And both these texts that they give differ significantly from the versions published in the 1760s. And they also differ slightly from each other. So previously I dated the Gaelic version also to the 7 Years' War, and the related English version to the American War of Independence, but I now like to turn the dating on its head and propose that McLagan and Gillis's English version is actually the oldest and dates from much earlier than we might expect. I think that actually the version that they give dates from 1745 or soon after. I'd like to show you this text. So the beginning is still quite similar. Garb of Old Gaul, the fire of Old Rome. We've seen this before. No intemperate tables. In the third stanza, we've got something like that. But then it also changes a bit. So as you can see, stanzas 1 and 3 have close equivalents in the audio text that you've just read earlier. But there's major differences, for example, in what is here stanza 4. And there are also entire stanzas which appear only here or only in the 1760s. And this version here also lacks a chorus. 1760s had one. But the whiff of noble savagery is present in this text too. In stanza 1, still we've got the Gauls who resisted Roman imperialism for some time. We've got the romanticization of Highland dress. We've got allusion to the ancient Caledonians and so on. There's clearly noble savagery. Now, we said that British mainstream images of Highland savages mainly stressed the ignoble and only became noble and romantic after the final defeat of Jacobitism and after the British Army's increased recruitment of Highland soldiers from the 50s onwards. But some earlier instances of romantic noble savagery have already been noted in connection with Highland soldiers by scholars like Murray Pittock and Hugh Cheap in Jacobite sources from the 1680s onwards. So because the Jacobites relied so heavily on Highland soldiers, they were ready to romanticize Highland soldiers much earlier than the mainstream was. But, of course, Highland soldiers were not just in the Jacobite army. Since the foundation of the Black Watch Regiment in 1725, there were also some Highland companies in the British government army, even before the mass recruitment of the 1750s. And it's not unthinkable that Highland soldiers of the 1740s may have wanted to wrest the brand of the noble savage hero from the Jacobites and use it for themselves as loyal fighters for the Hanoverian government, although the Anglophone mainstream was not yet ready to accept this image and continued to see Highlanders mainly as ignobly savage Jacobite rebels for quite some time. So here's why I think that this song goes back to the 1740s. Whereas the versions published in the 1760s have clear references to the 7 Years' War, fighting in Cape Breton and Quebec, there are no such references in McLagan and Gillis's version. There's a different reference to the French as an enemy and an other in terms of faith and manners in stanza 3. So the Catholics, French faith, and foppery, a bit effeminate, too fancy, not nobly savage, over civilized. So we've got that here. So this might also have been said in the 7 Years' War, but equally it makes sense in the 1740s, 70s, and 80s in view of France's support for the Jacobite rebels in the 40s, but also later France's support for the American revolutionaries in the 1770s and 1780s. Oops, sorry. So there were also French plans for invading Britain in all these three conflicts, which would match the threat of foreign invasion that's mentioned in stanza 5 of this version. But the 1740s might be the closest match for a song associated with Highland regiments, because part of the Black Watch was actually sent to England in the autumn of 1745 with the express purpose of guarding the country against a potential French invasion. As we see, since it's supposed to be, it's by a Black Watch officer the tune, and it's later become the signature tune of the Black Watch. It could very well be that, the occasion was the Black Watches posting to England, guarding against the French invasion in aid of the Jacobites. The references to rebels and factionalism in stanzas 4 and 6 definitely do not make sense in the 7 Years' War. A foreign enemy like the French can hardly be called rebels. You can only be a rebel if you fight against your own government. The mention of factionalism also points to internal conflicts among British subjects. Again, this would make sense concerning the Jacobite risings of the 40s or later in the American War of Independence. But the American rebels were not particularly associated with coming down from the hills. And of course, this song has something about, coming down, stanza 4, coming down from the hills to the field. So that again points more to the 1745, with the Highland armies, coming down from the north and then coming all the way to Derby in England, in aid of Jacobitism. So the reference to defending British laws and liberties in stanza 4 also best fits the 1740s, when the Hanoverian forces could be seen to protect the post-1689 constitutional monarchy against the restoration of Stuart absolutism. The explicit endorsement of King George also makes sense, again, stanza 4, George and the laws. That also makes most sense as an implicit rejection of a Stuart rival, James and Charles Edward Stuart, who are the leaders of the Jacobites. So even the two other Anglophone versions of the song that were updated and published in the 1760s contain passages that might also apply with equal or even greater plausibility to the 1740s, and thus might be vestiges of some earlier texts from that period. So the chorus, which is absent in the McLagan-Gillies version, has further references to a French enemy, French and Spaniards, and an additional Spanish one. Again, this reflected enmities of both the 7 Years' War and the Jacobite period. But like McLagan and Gillies' stanza 4, the chorus here also mentions defending British laws and liberties, which seems most fitting for the 1740s. Moreover, the 1769 version retains the reference to factionalism in stanza 6, which we also found in the McLagan and Gillies version, and which also seems more fitting for the intra-British conflict between 1740s Jacobites and Hanoverians. And the reputed authors of our song were also already active in the government army during the 45, not in the Black Watch, but in other regiments who were involved in fighting the Jacobites. John Reid, the composer, was an officer in Loudon's Highlanders, and Harry Erskine was with the 1st Royal Scots. The latter was not a specifically Highland regiment, but Erskine was doubtlessly aware of the new Highland companies in the government army and may have felt inspired to compose a text in their praise. The song may have started as a general praise of Highland soldiers and only got specifically linked to the Black Watch a little later. Another point that's worth considering relates to the different ways in which the Highlanders are portrayed. All the versions discussed here give them not only noble savagery, but also a few traits of the Romans, who are generally thought to be an epitome of civilization rather than savagery. So the Highlanders are said to share the Romans' fire, the fire of old Rome, which here probably means a zeal for military conquest. Moreover, all the versions construct a Highland speaker who makes references to Roman and Greek deities. Knowledge of Greek and Roman culture was not only considered a mark of civilization in ancient times, but also in educated, mainstream, 18th century Anglophone and European culture, which is penchant for classicism. So the Highland speaker in these song lyrics is not just a backcountry savage, but someone endowed with respectable international cultural capital. He knows classical gods. The longest and most interesting classicist passage is in the McLagan-Gillies version. It first acknowledges the marginal status of Gaelic culture by saying that the Highland garb is still despised at the centres of power, and the cities connote political power, seats of government, but also cultural power as centres of academic learning and Anglophone, cosmopolitan, modern, sophisticated elite culture. And the same can be said of courts, if we assume this to mean royal courts and mainstream aristocratic fashions rather than law courts. Or if we assume a composition date not during, but shortly after the 45-46 Rebellion, courts could refer to law courts, namely the legal ban of Highland dress in many spheres of life outside the army between 1747 and 1782. Although the classical gods initially debate the civilized merits of Highland garb, in the end they give it their civilized stamp of approval. Mars received from his Venus a smile and a nod. The suggestion that Highland culture can be combined with modern classicist high cultural fashions was also made by 18th century Gaelic poets that actually composed in Gaelic, such as Alistair MacDonald, who wove classicist references into his Gaelic poetry. He's also a Jacobite, by the way. But finding this notion in a mid-18th century Anglophone text on the side of the government is a bit more unusual. And maybe this unusual sympathy for Gaelic cultural potential was also the reason why this military text from, I would argue, the 1740s did not yet find its way into print until 2 decades later. Beyond the narrow confines of Highland regiments and their Anglophone members, maybe especially in the officer class, a wider Anglophone reading public on the print market may not have been ready for this sort of text, given that the image of Highlanders as ignobly savage others was still so dominant. However, the song clearly retained enough appeal among Highland soldiers to be remembered and revised over a decade later, when the Anglophone text from the 1740s was translated into Gaelic in a way that closely mirrored the original, but also featured another update to fit the new situation of the 7 Years' War. That's like what the Gaelic text looks like. Now the update here. Here it is in kind of McLagan's English translation and also my own translation, which is a bit closer to the Gaelic even. So Morrison deleted the old stanza 4 with its obvious allusions to the Jacobite rebellion and replaces these with this new stanza that expressly mentioned the Marquis de Montcalm. Marquis de Montcalm was a French commander in the 7 Years' War and mortally wounded during the aforementioned Battle of Quebec in 1759. So this clearly then, this is 7 Years' War. There's nothing for it. I've also tried to find out more about the context in which this translation and update were produced and by whom. I checked McLagan's brief reference to this Mr. Morrison against other sources such as military records and found out that there was indeed a Donald Morrison from the Isle of Lewis who held the rank of sergeant's mate, so assistant sergeant in Simon Fraser's company in the 78th Regiment of Foot, which is also known as the Fraser Highlanders. They fought in the 7 Years' War from 1758 onwards and were disbanded in 1763. Donald Morrison is said to have composed various Gaelic song lyrics, including a piece on the death of General Wolfe, the British leader at the Battle of Quebec. So both leaders died, both Montcalm and Wolfe, in 1759, although I have not yet seen any of these other poems. So you can see still work in progress. I'm still chasing more information on Morrison's life and his other works. Now, the appeal of this song to a man like Donald Morrison might partly have lain in its praise of earlier Highland soldiers, and also in his own position in one of the contemporary Highland regiments who had recently had such splendid success. For instance, the 78th Regiment, where he worked, was involved in both the Siege of Louisbourg, which we heard before in Quebec, in Cape Breton, and in the Battle of Quebec, where Montcalm met his death. Reed's Black Watch and Erskine's 1st Regiment of Foot, alias the Royal Scots, fought both on the North American mainland and in the Caribbean. Though not officially a Highland regiment, the Royal Scots, Erskine's regiment, had a high percentage of Highlanders amongst them, and Erskine transferred to this regiment in December 1762. As a Gael and a Highland soldier, Morrison might have valued this poem as a way of gaining or asserting ethnic respectability. But the song's use of educated classicist references as a sign of cultural capital and a means to gain social respectability for formerly despised underdogs may also have appealed to Morrison in terms of class. Unlike physicians who were university trained, 18th century surgeons could enter their branch of medicine via apprenticeships. So we might be looking at an author with much less academic education than Erskine, read or MacLagan had, who were all middle class or upper class people, but who, by undertaking this translation, also associates himself with this text and claims a share in the text's use of cultural capital that is normally associated with classicist academic study like grammar schools and universities. We might also remember that ambitious people from lower social ranks could use the military as a means to travel, expand their horizons, extend their education, and engage in social climbing. Another 18th century Gaelic poet who comes to mind here is the famous Donnacha Ban Machcantur, Duncan Ban McIntyre. More research is needed into Morrison's biography, but it is possible that he was also a lower class individual who used the military and his poetry in this way for social climbing and to claim cultural capital and to gain social prestige and maybe also assert the respectability of the ethnic group that he came from. So here romantic images of Highlanders as tough noble savages with military talents could mean a professional opportunity, but the cultural condescension involved might also be galling to a Gael, especially one with social ambition. It might have been such ambiguities that piqued Morrison into embracing this particular song and its assertion that a supposed savage could not just be noble but also cultured. And the Anglophone versions of the song that were published in the 1760s have different references to the 7 Years' War. So they were probably independent of Morrison's Gaelic version and only worked from the 1740s English version, to which they are still very close in wording at times. If we compare the different versions, we also notice that the fairly long classicist passages here in MacLagan's and Gillis's versions are greatly reduced in the Anglophone versions that were published in the 1760s, so this long passage just becomes a single stanza. The scene with the Council of Classical Gods has entirely disappeared. In this new stanza here. And the scene with we only get the old reference to the Roman fire, and these new stanzas with Minerva and Boreas is one word dimensions of the classical culture. No more Council of Gods and Mars and all of that. Venus, this all disappears. While the new redactor might have been ready to accept Highlanders as worthy British soldiers, he or she was apparently reluctant to accept them as educated and civilized people who could partake of modern middle and upper class culture. So the classicist elements are cut back, and instead we get additional lines that equate the Highlanders more with nature than with culture. Okay. Oh, sorry. So they're likened to deer, trees, rocks and storms, and thus demoted in the chain of being from supposedly superior humans to animals, plants, inanimate objects, and weather phenomena. Since savages are supposedly closer to nature, the Highland noble savages now appear less hybrid and more savage than in the earlier version, and are closer to conventional Anglophone discourse about Highlanders as a complete other. But there's still more to that. The wording of these 1760 stanzas is also interesting for another reason. The wording of the passages, marked in green, is rather similar to phrases that appear in one of the best-selling literary works of the time. And this is James Macpherson's best-selling Ossianic prose poetry. Macpherson is a Highlander himself. He is educated in classicist tradition. He speaks English. His English is arguably better than his Gaelic, but he sets out as a young man to collect Gaelic poetry and Gaelic stories, and the Anglophone acquaintances that he has amongst the educated classes learn about his collection and ask him to publish this. And he feels he can't publish this in original form. He polishes it. He makes it into prose poems, so poetry gets changed to prose. He adapts it to 18th century literary tastes, but he kind of pretty much sells it off as a supposedly authentic product of the Gaelic Dark Ages, which has come down in oral tradition. So there's a bit of a, he was accused of fraud when people got behind that. But anyway, it was a popular bestseller, his Ossianic prose poems, and these were published between 1760 and 1763. And the wording is quite distinctive. And And I feel that, you know, the words used in this song are actually reminiscent of Macpherson's wording, and I pretty much feel that the redactor in the 60s probably read Macpherson beforehand. So we're told at the Oak on the Mount of the Vale, we've got in Macpherson, we've got also comparisons between the heroes and oak trees. And here's the references on where you would find this if you opened Macpherson's text. Then heroes are fleet, meaning swift, as a roe deer, also in Macpherson, but also in our song. There's also references to hounds hunting roes in Macpherson. Then Macpherson also has comparisons between shields and the moon. I mean, yes, they're both rounds, but it's probably not a very well-known metaphor anyway. It doesn't, or a very well-known simile. It's not very hackneyed. It seems quite peculiar to Macpherson that he compares shields and the moon. And there's also comparisons to the moon in autumn, although in this case Macpherson doesn't use shields for that comparison, but he compares a beautiful woman to the moon in autumn. But the phrase moon in autumn is definitely there. Then storm in the ocean, heroes are also compared to storms in Macpherson's works. And we tremendous as rocks, heroes are also compared to rocks in Macpherson. And then Macpherson also uses the phrase sons of the mountains. Now, the song uses it as a kenning for Highland humans. Macpherson is a bit different. He uses it as a kenning for deer, not humans, but still it could be. I mean, it is an iconic phrase. It occurs repeatedly in Macpherson's work, and it might have stuck in our redactor's memory when he composed this new stanza for the Garb of Old Gaul. So in view of all this, I think it's very likely that Macpherson's works were a direct influence on these new stanzas, which also incidentally helps to date the composition of these versions. We're now definitely in the 1760s because that was, you know, Macpherson started publishing at this time. So we can't be, say, in 1756 because that would be pre-Macpherson. Now, like the song text and the Highland regiments that it came from, Macpherson's literary project also moved back and forth between languages and cultures. He as well tried to represent Highlanders and their traditions as acceptable elements of an Anglo-centric British nation, and uneasily negotiated cultural stereotypes, Gaelic self-perceptions, hierarchies, and an individual and collective desire for social climbing. And whatever we think of Macpherson and, you know, these accusations of forgery, of fraud, his success did generate enough public interest in Gaelic literature to create a market for the publication of more genuine Gaelic literature, such as the poems of Donogh Ban Maccantur, Duncan Ban MacIntyre, previously mentioned, another soldier poet, or the likewise aforementioned Gaelic anthology from the 1780s that also contained Maclagan's versions of our song today. So even the earliest versions of this song, with their claims to classicist learning and education, now found their way into print and offered a rival image of the Highland soldier to the more primitive image that was popularized by the 1760s versions. So this is kind of a more primitive, you know, dehumanizing version. And then, as we saw earlier, the Gaelic version is kind of, you know, it's laying more claim to classical learning than the other one. So even though the 1760s versions of the Garb of Old Gaul remained much better known, at least among Anglophone audiences, the Maclagan version does, you know, I think lay claim to a more civilized image of the Gaels, and it's out there, even though it's less known. Moreover, the 1740s Anglophone text, with its reference to the rebels, then referring to the Jacobites, may again have seemed topical in the 1780s with the recent memories of the rebels who started the American War of Independence. So that would be another reason why, you know, also, kind of, you know, Gillis might have thought this is a good moment to publicize it, so Maclagan might have thought. And of course, Maclagan was in the Black Watch during the American War of Independence, and he might have circulated that there as well. So maybe these earlier stanzas from the 1740s were again sung in the regiments during this most recent colonial war in America in the 70s and 80s. And the movement of this text across places and cultures does not end here. For example, a second Gaelic translation by a Captain McIntyre, this time based on the 1760s version, was published in 1840, and two versions of Morrison's earlier translation appear in a major Gaelic text collection from the later 19th century, John Dewar's manuscript collection, which I can't go into detail here, but we can see that the Gaels definitely found this song appealing, and and there's something about their identities that was kind of touched by the song in some way, and so they kept perpetuating this. There's also now at the moment major research going on into the Dewar manuscripts, which are currently being edited and published as a complete edition for the very first time. So this is in progress as well. And again, we've got Dewar is also a lower class guy who's engaging with literature as a means of social climbing. So the story goes on about poetry and class and Anglicization and mediation and publishing things to an Anglophone audience. So I hope I've shown that this apparently simple propaganda song, the Garb of Old Gaul from, I think, the 1840s, has a very intriguing textual history. There's more to it than meets the eye, and it yields interesting insights into imperial, ethnic and class identities in the 18th and 19th centuries. Thank you.